The morning started like any other. Ethan was frantically searching for his phone, lifting couch cushions and checking under newspapers. We'd been living together on weekends for the past 7 months, spending 3 nights a week in this space that had begun to feel like home. When he mentioned he couldn't find his phone, I offered to help and headed to the bedroom. I found it wedged between the mattress and the wooden headboard, probably fallen there during one of our late-night Netflix sessions. As I picked it up, the screen remained illuminated, still unlocked and open to a group chat I'd never seen before. The name at the top read, "The Boys," and my heart began to sink as I scanned the visible messages. The conversation was clearly recent, with Dom asking about plans for Percy's birthday that night. Ethan had enthusiastically confirmed his attendance, but it was Percy's question about someone named Zoe that made my blood run cold. Ethan had casually mentioned picking her up at 8, as if this was completely normal. My hands trembled as I scrolled up through hundreds of messages spanning weeks. What disturbed me most was how naturally Ethan's relationship with Zoe was discussed. Tom was asking Ethan to bring Zoe's friends for potential dates, and there were casual mentions of previous gatherings where she'd been present. Then I found the messages that made my stomach drop completely. Theo had asked about that work girl Ethan had mentioned before, and Ethan's response was devastating. He'd written that I was just a friend, nothing serious, that he'd told them it wasn't anything important. Our 7-month relationship, something I'd considered one of the most meaningful connections of my life, was dismissed like an inconvenient detail. The evidence continued mounting as I scrolled further. There were references to nights Ethan had spent with the group and Zoe, nights when he'd told me he was working late or needed alone time. I remembered those evenings vividly. I'd respected his need for space, used those nights to catch up with friends or read books, always looking forward to his text checking in. Photos shared in the group showed Ethan with his arm around Zoe at various gatherings. In one particularly painful image from just 2 weeks ago, they were at what looked like a camping trip, surrounded by smiling friends. That was the weekend Ethan had told me he had severe food poisoning. I'd been so worried that I'd made homemade chicken soup and delivered it to his apartment, spending Saturday afternoon caring for him while he pretended to be sick. When Ethan called asking if I'd found his phone, I took a moment to compose myself. I walked back to the living room where he was checking the kitchen counter and held up the phone, asking the question that would change everything. Who was Zoe? The transformation in his face was immediate. The color drained from his cheeks, and his eyes widened with the look of someone caught in something terrible. He tried deflecting, asking why I was going through his phone, but I'd seen enough to demand answers. When I confronted him about his friends assuming he was dating Zoe and their apparent ignorance of my existence, Ethan began squirming uncomfortably. His explanation about his friends being judgmental felt hollow. He claimed he'd wanted to keep our relationship private initially, because his friends had always given him trouble about women he dated. After a couple months had passed, it felt too awkward to suddenly announce he had a girlfriend. But his explanation about Zoe truly devastated me. She wasn't just some random friend, she was someone from their college group who clearly had history with this circle. He admitted to hanging out with her when he was with his friends, but the chat messages and photos painted a much more intimate picture. When I showed him evidence of Zoe staying over at his place, his face crumpled. His attempts to explain felt pathetic and scripted. He claimed he didn't mean for it to happen, that things with Zoe had started friendly, that his friends had pushed them together and it was easier to go along with it. The phrase "just happened" made my blood boil. I pointed out all the lies, the late nights at work, the quiet evenings at home, the visits to his parents I'd never been invited to join. Each excuse now had new context, and I felt foolish for believing them so readily. Piecing together the timeline was particularly crushing. We'd met 7 months ago, fallen into a comfortable rhythm of seeing each other several times a week. 3 months in, when I thought we were becoming serious and exclusive, he'd apparently reconnected with Zoe. Instead of choosing, he decided to maintain both relationships through elaborate deception. The photos showed how integrated Zoe was into his social life. She was clearly the girl he brought around his friends, the one they knew and accepted as his girlfriend. I was the secret he kept separate, someone he downplayed to anyone who asked. To his friends, I was some clingy coworker with unrequited feelings. When I asked why he'd done this instead of simply choosing one of us, Ethan couldn't provide a coherent answer. He mumbled about not knowing, about thinking his situation with Zoe would naturally resolve itself, about being stuck juggling both relationships. The phrase was particularly offensive, as if we were inconvenient objects rather than human beings deserving honesty and respect. Learning that Zoe knew nothing about me made the betrayal feel even worse. At least if she'd known, there would have been some honesty somewhere. But no. He was lying to both of us, maintaining completely separate lives. When I announced I was leaving, Ethan panicked. He jumped up, promising he could fix everything. He'd end things with Zoe, tell everyone about us. But 7 months of lies couldn't be undone with sudden promises made only after being caught. His final attempt to explain revealed that when we first met, he'd been looking for something casual. Zoe was already part of his established friend group, they had history, and he characterized their relationship as nothing serious. But when things with me became more important, he found himself unable to handle the complicated situation he'd created. His admission that he didn't know how to fix the mess without losing me felt like cruel irony. by trying to keep both of us, he'd guaranteed losing me completely. I told him he'd never really had me. He'd had a version of me who trusted him, who thought she knew him, but that person no longer existed. I managed to maintain composure until I reached my car. Sitting in the parking lot, I broke down completely. 7 months of memories crashed over me. Our first kiss, the first time he told me he loved me, lazy Sunday mornings, discussions about moving in together more permanently. Every memory now carried new weight and new questions. My phone buzzed with the first of many messages from Ethan begging me to come back so we could talk, but I couldn't bear more explanations. I drove home and immediately called my best friend Nadia, telling her everything that had happened. Nadia arrived with wine and listened without judgment as I told the story again. As we talked, I realized how isolated I'd become in the relationship. Ethan had never explicitly discouraged me from seeing friends, but his schedule had become the center of my social life. I'd prioritized our relationship over maintaining other connections. Another text arrived from Ethan claiming he'd broken things off with Zoe and promising to make our relationship public. Nadia pointed out that these were actions he could have taken months ago, but chose not to. Now that he was caught, he was making desperate gestures to control damage. I blocked his number that night. The following weeks were some of the darkest I'd experienced. Beyond practical aspects of untangling our semi-shared life, the emotional work was challenging. I found myself second-guessing everything about our relationship and my own judgment. Sleep became elusive as I replayed conversations, looking for clues I'd missed. 3 weeks after our breakup, I was at the grocery store when someone called my name. I turned to see Theo, one of Ethan's friends from the group photos. He apologized immediately, explaining that Ethan had finally told them everything, and they were appalled. Ethan had consistently portrayed me as someone from work who had feelings for him that he didn't reciprocate, some unfortunate colleague with a one-sided crush. The conversation was awkward but validating. Hearing that even his friends were disgusted by his actions helped counter some self-blame I'd been carrying. Theo mentioned that Zoe had ended things once she learned about me. He'd been the one to tell her, unable to stomach being part of the deception any longer. That night, I opened my laptop and created a document titled "Red Flags I Ignored." He'd never wanted photos of us together. He'd always had excuses for why I couldn't meet his friends. He'd gotten visibly anxious the few times we'd run into people he knew in public. He'd been deliberately vague about his whereabouts when we weren't together. He'd changed the subject whenever I'd suggested meeting his family. Looking at this list, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Part of me was angry at myself for not seeing the patterns, but a larger part recognized that I'd made reasonable choices based on incomplete information. Trust had to start somewhere, and his explanations had seemed plausible at the time. 2 months after the breakup, I finally felt ready to start socializing again. We went to a new bar downtown, and I made a genuine effort to enjoy myself. I noticed Noah before he approached. He had an easy smile and seemed genuinely interested in conversation rather than just making an impression. We talked for hours, and I found myself surprised by how easy it felt. He asked follow-up questions, remembered details from earlier in our conversation, and shared his own stories without trying to one-up mine. When my friends were ready to leave, he asked for my number with no pressure. I was honest about coming out of a difficult relationship and needing to take things slowly. His response about liking slow because it gave people time to actually get to know each other felt like a revelation. Here was someone who didn't see patience as an obstacle, but as an opportunity. By our third date, Noah suggested meeting his friends for trivia night. When I expressed surprise at the timeline, he seemed genuinely confused by my hesitation. Why wouldn't he want me to meet people important to him? The trivia night was a revelation. Noah's friends were warm and welcoming, treating me like someone they were genuinely happy to meet. There were no inside jokes that excluded me, no sense that my presence was complicating existing dynamics. I was simply Noah's date, and that was enough for them to accept me completely. As our relationship progressed, I continued noticing differences between how Noah and Ethan approached dating. Noah took photos of us together and posted them on social media without drama. He talked about me to his friends and family, incorporating me into his existing life rather than keeping me in a separate compartment. 6 months after discovering Ethan's group chat, I ran into him at a coffee shop near my office. He looked terrible. The confident, well-groomed man I'd known had been replaced by someone who looked like he hadn't been sleeping or eating properly. When he recognized me, his face went through several emotions: surprise, shame, hope, and resignation. He approached hesitantly, mentioning wanting to reach out and claiming he'd changed. I kept my distance, responding politely but without warmth. He told me he missed me every day, words that once would have made my heart race. Now they just made me sad. Not for what I'd lost, but for what he'd thrown away. When I informed him I was seeing someone new, someone who wasn't afraid to have me in his life, the pain in his expression was evident. His protest that he'd never been ashamed of me rang hollow. Maybe he hadn't felt ashamed, but his actions had communicated shame whether he'd intended them to or not. His apology seemed genuine, and I found myself believing he truly regretted his choices. But regret isn't enough to undo months of deception and betrayal. I wished him well, meaning it sincerely, and walked away feeling lighter than I had in months. That evening, I told Noah about seeing Ethan. His response was perfect. He asked how I felt about it without jealousy or insecurity. When I described feeling relieved and finally at peace, he reminded me that I deserved someone who was proud to be with me publicly and privately. Looking back now, I still sometimes marvel at how completely I'd been deceived. 7 months of believing I was in an exclusive, committed relationship, while my partner maintained another relationship entirely. But I also recognize the tremendous growth that came from surviving such betrayal. I learned to trust my instincts more, to ask harder questions when something felt off, and to understand that healthy relationships don't require such patience with inexplicable behavior. Most importantly, I discovered what it feels like to be with someone who chooses you openly and consistently. Now I'm with someone who sees being with me not as a complication to manage, but as a gift to celebrate. Noah and I have built something based on honesty, mutual respect, and genuine integration of our lives. No secrets, no compartments, no careful scheduling to avoid conflicts. Just two people who decided to build something together and follow through on that decision every day. The experience with Ethan was devastating, but it prepared me to recognize and appreciate authentic love when it came along. Without experiencing the confusion and pain of being someone's secret, I might not have recognized how extraordinary it is to be someone's choice, not just in private moments, but in every aspect of life.